Okay. Oh, maybe we lost her again. Okay. Good to have you back.
So before the break, I was giving you the example of Camille Paglia, who's a fairly well-known feminist and lesbian, but she rejects the postmodern notion that sex is just a social construction. She says, no, no, no. Nature made us male and female. Humans are a sexually reproducing species. And so you say, well, how do you defend being a lesbian then? And here are her exact words. She says, well, why not defy nature? After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So do you see the logic there? If our bodies are products of mindless material forces, purposeless forces, then they have no intrinsic purpose that we are morally obligated to respect. They give no clue to our identity. They are not the basis for any moral message. We may do with them as we see fit. And the opposite of that, of course, the Christian worldview says, no, no, God did make things for a purpose, and it's evident to observation that living things are designed for a purpose, that eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, that wings are made for flying, and fins are made for swimming. In fact, the development of the entire organism is driven by an inbuilt plan or blueprint. So the Christian view of nature is that it is teleological, which means it's driven by a purpose. So science itself shows that living things are structured for a purpose. And what Christians are saying is that when we live in harmony with that purpose, we will be happier and healthier.
Well, okay, so maybe I'm taking you a little bit afield, but I'm still kind of stuck on this the subtleties that surround the whole argument about panentheism and panpsychism. Not because I buy them, but because I hear so many arguments around these things. And one of the things that it makes me think about is if I go all the way back to the very beginning, when all there was, well, I mean, so God creates the universe. The universe now is, whether we're thinking it's the Big Bang or how it was that he created the universe, it comes into being. And what comes into being, according to the quantum physicists at least, is at the particle level, and the particles and the laws and gravity. So the physical laws and the particles are what comes into being. When you talk teleology, are you talking teleology all the way down to the level of the particles, of the chemicals, of the, before we ever get to biological entities? Does teleology exist all the way down at the particle level?
Sure. That's a fine-tuning problem. The fine-tuning problem of the universe basically is that even on the level of the physical structure of the universe, we can see design. For a long time, there's a design argument focused on living things. Mm-hmm. But now there are two. In Finding Truth, since that's the book we're talking about, in Finding Truth, I deal with what I think are the two most compelling arguments. One is DNA and information theory, but the other one is the fine-tuning of the universe. We've come to see that the universe itself has a structure that seems to speak of design. In other words, there's a kind of complexity that we don't find being produced by randomness or by chance. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the major fundamental constants, that's how scientists speak about them. The fundamental constants of the universe have certain values, mathematical values, like the force of gravity, or the ratio of the proton to the electron, or the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force.
Mhm.
All of these have particular values that have to be precisely what they are, or the universe would not be able to support life, not just life as we know it, but no life at all. And so this is called the fine-tuning problem. And so people have come to realize that teleology seems to be at the physical level as well as the biological level. It's really pretty much the same argument as in biology. You know, what we do when we look at DNA is we say, you know, there's a structure that reflects the kind of structure that minds create.
Mhm.
And it does not reflect, you know, it's not just natural forces couldn't do it, because a purely negative argument is not really persuasive, but positively it has the kind of structure that minds create and nothing else does. And the fine-tuning of the universe shows the same thing. There's no physical reason, for example, why the force of gravity is what it is. And yet if it was off just, you know, a tiny fraction, the tiniest fraction, the universe would not exist. So I have an article in the New York Times says these are like knobs. It's as if there's a universe creating machine, and there are little knobs for each one of these fundamental constants. And what you find is that none of them are preset. They could have been anywhere. In other words, there's no natural force causing gravity to be to have the particular value that it has. So the metaphor is the knobs could be twirled any direction. They're not preset. And yet they all just happen to be set at where they need to be for to create a universe where life can exist. The New York Times says they seem almost miraculously tuned to allow life. So yes, teleology, this is relatively new, that teleology now we can see goes down to the physical level, not just the biological.
So what I'm trying to understand then, and I'm not trying to, well, my question is, when some of these people talk about consciousness as being fundamental, is it that they are absolutizing consciousness, or is it that they are seeing something about the fundamental nature of the universe, that there is mind that has a teleology for these created things that are inside of the universe?
Okay, so you're saying, can a Christian be a panpsychist?
Well, I'm trying to understand where the dividing line is, because there are, for example, one of the guys that we've read quite a lot of his work and we listen to quite a lot is Ian McGilchrist. I don't know if you've run into his work. He is a neuroscientist and a poet and an author. He's written a marvelous book called The Master and His Emissary that looks at the two hemispheres of the brain.
Oh yeah.
He spent like 20 years researching and writing this book, but it's not just looking at the scientific material about the two hemispheres of the brain, but looking at the entire history of civilization and how it appears that at various points in civilization, either the left hemisphere has been in control or the right hemisphere has been in control, because they have two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. Our minds need both hemispheres because it gives us a binocular vision, so to speak. But most of the time, at least in the last 300-400 years since the Enlightenment, it appears that the left hemisphere has taken control away sort of from the right hemisphere, because the right hemisphere has the kind of open attention that receives from the world, or receives from outside of itself, that which can be known, brings it in. And the way that the brain operates, according to him, is that the right hemisphere is the only hemisphere that has access to the outside, bringing in this knowledge, transferring it to the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere can only work on what's been given to it by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere has this kind of attention that is focused, grasping, taking apart, building, creating things.
Analytical.
Yes, the very analytical, atomizing kind of a perspective on the left hemisphere. But that from his point of view and the way he sees how the universe operates, the left hemisphere is supposed to give all of this work that it's done back to the right hemisphere so that that information will have a holistic perspective to look at the world, rather than looking at the world solely through this analytical lens. Because if you do that, then you lose all of art, you lose all of culture, you lose all of poetry and all of that. But he's starting to come down on this panpsychist side. He's trying to understand where the meaning lies in the world. That's kind of what we focus on here. We're looking at Jordan Peterson, who's trying to find some meaning in the world. You know, Ian McGilchrist. There's another neuroscientist by the name of John Vervaeke, who's done a lot of work on the meaning crisis. And I recently talked with Mark Solms, who's written a book on the origin of consciousness. They're all trying to understand this, and many of them, as they're on this search, they seem to fall into this panpsychist pot. So, and partly it is because they haven't yet discovered the God of the universe who created the universe. So I'm trying to understand where the division point is between panpsychism, panentheism, and what you're calling biblical Christianity.
Historically speaking, many Christians have been panpsychists.
Okay.
Before the Enlightenment, a lot of Christians were panpsychists. So let me just, I talk about it in this book, The Soul of Science.
Oh, yay, there's a book for it.
A lot of Christians have been panpsychists. Before the Enlightenment, you know, even many of the early modern scientists were panpsychists. They were Christians and they were panpsychists. They had no problem with saying that maybe there's a spiritual presence, or what we would now, I don't think they used the word consciousness back then so much as spiritual. They had no problem with there being a spiritual presence in the universe, in the earth, in animals, in plants. Mm-hmm. They had no problem with that. And it was really interesting reading that historically, because these were Christians. John Donne, the poet John Donne, for example, still talked about the anima mundi. Anima mundi means the soul of the world. Mm-hmm. They thought there was a soul of the world. And they didn't have any problem with thinking that competed with our belief in God. God mm-hmm. created the world with a soul, just mm-hmm. like he created us with souls. They had no problem with that. And so it's only since the Enlightenment that even Christians kind of gave up that notion. And Lewis writes about it. He says we lost the spirits in the trees and the spirits in the woods, and the spirits in the mountains and the spirits in the brooks.
That's in The Discarded Image.
I think so. Yeah. I quote it in my book Saving Leonardo, when he says mm-hmm. basically we lost the notion that there were spirits in nature, mm-hmm. and
disenchanted.
Disenchanted is the word that we agree with deification. We do agree that it's not God, but mm-hmm. the disenchantment, we don't have to agree with that. I don't have any problem with the earlier Christians who thought there were spirits, there was spiritual presence somehow in nature, and that God made those spirits just as he made our spirit. Mm-hmm. They didn't see any contradiction between that and Christianity.
Well, okay, so then earlier when you were talking about people who absolutize consciousness, are you differentiating between people who absolutize consciousness and these people who were able to see the enchantment in the world prior to the Enlightenment?
Sure. Yeah. So Christians who said, hey, God created the anima mundi, the soul of the world, mm-hmm. Still saw God as the ultimate creator, and that God created these. But when we talk about secular worldviews, we're talking about people who are trying to find something to take the place of God, mm-hmm. right? I mean, that's what Romans 1 is saying. If you reject the biblical God, you exchange the glory of God for something in the created order. And so that's a very different dynamic where people say, well, you talked about the two hemispheres of the brain. And I do think it does have something to do with temperament. In other words, some people are more left, some people do live more on the left side, and some people do live more on the right side. They'll mm-hmm. find certain philosophies more compatible because of their own temperament. But in the West, let's stick sort of with Western intellectual history. You know, when you read Francis Schaeffer, he talks a lot about how the view of truth itself has been split. That what we now, he didn't use this language, but what we now call the fact value split, that there's all facts and that's objective and that's knowable and that's scientific. And then there's values where you can't stick them in a test tube or study them under a microscope. So they're in sort of an upper story. It's sort of tossed up into this attic where things are just relative and might be personally meaningful to you, but it's not really true. So he speaks a lot about that split view of truth and how that has affected us as Christians and our ability to communicate with the secular world. Because when we say Christianity is true, the secular person automatically, unreflexively throws it up into the upper story because, hey, that's religion. So that's in the upper story in Schaeffer's two-story metaphor. And so they don't even hear it as an objective truth claim. So his main concern was, that the split view of truth, using the metaphor of two stories in a building, hampers our ability to talk to secular people. But in my writing, here's another example where, like I'm doing in my class right now, I said, as I began to investigate, I thought, wait, your view of truth turns out to affect everything else. Even philosophy has been split into two streams, into an upper story and a lower story. And the technical term in philosophy is analytic, the analytic tradition versus the continental tradition. And the analytic tradition encompasses many isms. It started with the Enlightenment, but it encompasses, it starts with British empiricism. That's where most historians started. Empiricism, rationalism, naturalism, materialism, all of these lower story isms, meaning they claim to be scientific and they're all reductionistic, right? They all try to reduce humans to something less than fully human because the only thing that's real is what we know by science. Mm-hmm. Well, as you remember from your high school classes, English classes, there was a reaction against the Enlightenment called the Romantic movement. The Romantics saw pretty quickly where this was heading, and they said, no. We cannot accept such a dehumanizing, reductionistic view of people. Like you said a minute ago, it gets rid of the arts, it gets rid of beauty, it gets rid of meaning, it gets rid of love. We have to have some cognitive territory for these other things that the Enlightenment worldviews don't acknowledge. And so they essentially created the upper story, to use that metaphor of two stories in a building. The Romantics created an upper story. They said, well, there's rational truth and there's imaginative truth. I think that was Goethe, the poet Goethe, who used those two terms. That whatever terminology they use, the Romantics were the first to say there has to be another domain of truth. What you might have referred to earlier as the right brain. We need a domain where the right brain can function. And Hegel, I spoke about Hegel a minute ago, because he was the main philosopher who pretty much launched the whole upper story, which is the technical term is continental thought. So continental thought encompasses, like I said before, phenomenology, existentialism, postmodernism, and so on. And so, by the way, this is an easy way to make sense of all of Western thought. You don't have to memorize every ism. This is another shortcut for you. When I was a new Christian, I was trying to memorize each one, and no. If you recognize that there's a lower story, and all of the lower story worldviews share some commonalities, they all claim to be based on science, and they're all reductionistic. The upper story worldviews, the continental tradition, is all about finding a place for human consciousness, for the things that the right brain knows, for things like love, beauty, meaning, purpose, and so on. And so they never stopped asking the big questions, right? The big questions of philosophy. So it makes more sense when we realize that even philosophy has been split into these two major streams.
So do you think that when some of these people are searching for, you mentioned people that are in the secular worldview are searching for a substitute for God. do you think that some of these people who are searching for a substitute are doing so because the Christian worldview of the pre-enlightenment time is no longer available to them, so they don't even have any idea that there is a place in Christian thought for this worldview?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think you're onto something there, right? When I talk to people who are very upper story people or very right-brained people, I say, you have to realize that Christianity, Christians used to think like this.
Mhm.
They lost it too with the Enlightenment. And also I thought this is where you were going with your question. We also have to acknowledge as Christians that even if the secular worldview has an idol, even if it has a God substitute, even if it's trying to find a way to avoid the God of the Bible, that doesn't mean everything they say is false. They still have some good insights.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really cool about my book, Finding Truth, students often say this. They say, what I like about this book is it shows not only where secular worldviews go wrong, but it also helps us identify where they are right. Because my students will say, all the apologetics books I've read are about, the message seems to be everyone else is wrong.
Yeah, that's my problem with most apologists. Yeah.
And Finding Truth, I don't know if you remember this section, but I have a section where I say, it also shows you where they go right. Because take materialism. We are not materialists, but God made matter. And scientists who are materialists and who study matter often come up with very good insights because they're studying God's world. They're made in God's image and they're studying God's world. So they do come up with genuine insights. The empiricist, obviously, we don't reduce knowledge to what we can see, hear, weigh, and measure. But God did make the world with an empirical dimension. And in fact, many apologetics are empirical. The disciples said, what we have seen and heard, is what we touched, is what we tell you. My favorite example is when Paul is talking to the Roman rulers, and he says, the events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection did not happen in a corner. I like that phrase. It didn't happen in a corner, These were public events which were publicly verifiable. So empiricism, we do accept empirical truth because God made us with our senses. Or let's jump to the upper story, to the continental tradition. They emphasize consciousness. Well, of course, of course, they see a lot of truths when they go into the human mind and try to understand it better. Here's maybe this would be a way of getting at the difference. So the person who launched the upper story was Hegel. Hegel was explicitly trying to find an alternative to Orthodox Christianity. He wanted to find an alternative to the reductionism of the lower story of the Enlightenment materialism, but he didn't want to go back to Orthodox Christianity. So what he did is he read the medieval mystics who were mostly Neoplatonists. And he revived Neoplatonism, where God was sort of an internal spirit evolving in and through the universe. So there's where we would disagree, right? So we would say, okay, yes, you've made consciousness. And so I'll show you how he made it the main thing too, that for Hegel, every culture is expressing this universal spirit or mind in its current stage of evolution. And so he actually invented the word worldview. Did you know that? That's what it comes from Hegel. He said, because every culture is expressing the same universal mind or spirit, you will always find a relationship, a similarity, a common theme among its science, its culture, its religion, its law, its morality, and so on. You will always find a unity in any culture because it is expressing the universal mind or spirit at that stage of evolution. So it will have a world view, it will be united. But then, of course, the next stage of evolution, that truth is left behind and there's a new truth. And then that truth is left behind and there's a new truth because the absolute mind is constantly evolving to higher and higher levels of truth. So that's it.
So that's where Marx got his idea of the progression of history.
Absolutely. Yeah. He got rid of the absolute mind. He didn't like that. He wanted to say, no, it's a purely material process. So it's economic force. It's not mental forces driving the process. It's material forces. Economics is driving the process. He said, I've turned Hegel on his head. That he himself said that because he made matter the driving force. And, our mental life depends on our economic situation instead of the reverse. But Hegel literally said, individuals do not have ideas of their own. They are merely the unconscious tools of the absolute mind evolving through history. So that's where consciousness is what actually determines reality. And that's where eventually today, the individual does not have their own ideas. They're merely the mouthpiece for their social group, for their race, class, gender, and so on. It's straight from Hegel. Consciousness is what determines how you think, but not your personal consciousness, the group consciousness. So that would be the difference.
Do you think that Jung came? Do you think Jung came out of that world as well? Then, I mean, it sounds like there's a big connection there.
Yeah, I do. I absolutely. So Jung sort of, he's in the 20th century, so he kind of gets rid of the, he makes it he still says a cosmic consciousness or the unconscious, the universal consciousness. Yeah. He kind of psychologizes it a bit compared to Hegel. But if you want to say, where does he belong, lower story or upper story? The upper story is where consciousness is what determines reality. Yeah, Jung is in the upper story.
Okay, I'm sorry I'm getting you so far off the trail. I have these little things that I'm interested in myself. Like, so Dallas Willard is a guy that I've listened to quite a lot, and he's passed away now, but are you familiar with Dallas Willard, Christian teacher? He comes from the family of Husserl. And I thought that Husserl kind of came out of that Heidegger that came out of Hegel. Is that that's the right trail? So they're upper story.
The three H's. Yeah. How I teach my students. The upper story. Hegel, Heidegger, and Husserl. Or maybe it's Husserl and Heidegger. Yeah.
Yeah. So does that, questions are very hard to ask when they're this
I know,
personal and complicated, but I'm always trying to be very conscious that I don't fall over into the postmodern vat, because I've been a Christian now for 40 years, and I'm, as one of my conversation partners says, I am relentlessly curious. So I can get myself off on some trails that maybe don't always lead in the best places. So I'm always wondering, do I like somebody because the ideas are intriguing, or do I like them because the ideas are true? And so to me, Dallas Willard is very intriguing. But knowing that he comes from that thread that starts back there with Hegel, I'm just wondering if there are some danger signs that I should look for.
Well, you just have to read this book.
Yes, okay. Saving Leonardo.
You have to read Saving Leonardo, because there I really explain the upper lower story, the analytic tradition versus the continental tradition. I deal with the philosophers on each side. I deal with the art movements on each side, so that you can see how the philosophies were fleshed out in the artists. And absolutely, so Schaeffer, we talk about Francis Schaeffer. He's the one who popularized the very notion of an upper lower story divide. And Rookmacher, who you've talked about, they were influenced by a Dutch philosopher named Doyeweerd. Now, have you ever gone back that far?
I've heard of Doyeweerd, because
okay,
I'm sure that you have not heard of Paul van der Klee.
Oh yeah,
you have heard of Paul van der Klee. Oh,
yeah.
Okay, because he mentions Doyeweerd.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay,
so Paul is part of our corner of the internet.
Okay, yeah.
He's the one who got me doing this channel. So
good. Okay, so the notion, I said that Hegel was the guy who really invented the concept of worldview. Well, it was these Dutch philosophers, Doorwerth and Kuyper, who looked at what Hegel was saying and said, hey, wait a minute. When you describe Hegel's concept of worldview, that a culture, that there should be a common theme expressed through their art, their literature, their religion, their law, their morality, and so on. That's what Christianity really should be. And so they're the ones who actually brought the word worldview into the Christian world, were Doorwerth and Kuyper. We didn't talk about worldview before that. Kuyper brought it over to the States in his lectures on Calvinism. It was a series of lectures he did at Princeton University in the late 19th century. So the word worldview is really relatively new in the United States. Now, here's what's interesting about them, though. So Doorwerth was influenced by Husserl and Heidegger. Now, he was very careful to say where he disagreed with them, where he thought they were not biblical. But he was influenced by them, and so is John Paul II. By the way, John Paul II also talks a lot about the two-story divide, because he was a philosopher before he became Pope, and he taught phenomenology. He was a phenomenologist. So Husserl and Heidegger are, Husserl in particular, the philosophy connected with him is called phenomenology. So here are major Christian thinkers, Doorwerth, John Paul II, who were influenced by phenomenology. In fact, a lot of Catholics are. So many Catholics are influenced by phenomenology that secular philosophers began to complain that phenomenology had been taken over by Christians. Now, why did Christians like phenomenology? Here's why. Like you said, this is good. Let's see if I can simplify this. So the upper story has always been on the defensive because the lower story could claim science on its side. The materialists, the rationalists, the empiricists, the naturalists, they could all claim, well, science is on our side. And everyone knows that science is the ultimate truth. So the upper story, the continental tradition, and all of its isms have always been on the defensive. How can we claim that what we're looking at is true? And how can we fight reductionism? It's the upper story that made reductionism a bad word. A lot of people now recognize that if you call something reductionistic, that's negative. So, but it was because the upper story was trying desperately to fight the reductionism of the lower story worldviews. So, for example, Husserl says, how do we fight reductionism? Somehow we have to show that the materialist is only looking at part of reality. This isn't the whole reality, it's only part. How can we really build a case to help persuade people of that? Because obviously a lot of people are persuaded by materialism. So how can we show them that that's not true? Or more accurately, that it's partial truth, it's partly true. And so what he did is he said, let's see if we can look at the world with no preconceptions, with no presuppositions at all. What's happening today is that many people have already accepted materialism and naturalism. They start with that.
Yeah.
And then they say, well, of course, there's no soul or spirit or mind or consciousness. I mean, the cutting edge today is there's no consciousness. That even consciousness is an illusion.
Except for the people who say that consciousness is all there is. There's that other side too.
The upper story. I mean, that's why it's so.
I don't even mean the upper. I mean like guys like Yosha Bach, who just think that my consciousness is, well, it's very solipsistic really, but it's my consciousness is all that exists, and that it's sort of tied into this idea of AI, I guess, that or the simulation theory, maybe almost not quite like the simulation theory, but just like my mind creates my reality, and that's all that there is that my consciousness, not a world consciousness, just my consciousness.
No, right. You're right. That's probably solipsism.
Yeah.
At any rate, so many people just start with the assumption of materialism and naturalism. And so what Husserl said was, let's see if we can get rid of that preconception and just take in the world without filters. Can we take in the world without filters? And can we give equal weight to all of our experience, including mental experience and emotional experience and so on? And that will, if we can do that, he called that pre-theoretical experience or naive experience. He didn't mean naive in a negative way, but the experience that we have before we start trying to explain it with a philosophy. So our theoretical systems are based on pre-theoretical experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so the phenomenologists talked a lot about how can we get hold of pre-theoretical experience so that we can come up with ultimately a much richer philosophy. Well, people like Dewey use that, and John Paul II use that to support Christianity, as a way of saying, let's get back to pre-theoretical experience instead of being pressured into just having a modernist worldview. Let's see what we can learn from pre-theoretical experience. And for example, the materialist says there's no free will. You're just a complex biochemical machine. Well, if we attend to our pre-theoretical experience, it's very obvious that we do have free will, that we can make choices, and that we do so every day. There's a philosopher at USC named John Searle who says, if someone doesn't believe that there's such a thing as free will, then the next time they go to a restaurant, they should say, just bring me whatever the laws of nature have determined I will get. So that would be an example where they said, look, pre-theoretical experience contradicts this worldview. So which one should we go with? We should go with our pre-theoretical experience. Mm-hmm. Or Schaeffer used to call it universal human experience, because it's something that all people experience, whether, regardless of what their beliefs are, what their religion, what their philosophy. There are certain human universals like free will and love, and consciousness. So many of the things that materialism and naturalism says are not real, we know are real. We know by pre-theoretical experience.
I think that's what attracted me so much to Jordan Peterson. When he started teaching, a lot of his lectures that are online, when he's teaching the building of personality and so forth in his psychological lectures, he talks about Binswang and Boss coming out of the phenomenological world, and they use this word finesse, which means the shining. Oh. That there's something out in that at each moment in time I'm confronted by this world of infinite possibility, and how do I make my way through that path? Now the postmodernists would say there's so many choices that it's impossible. So there's no meaning to that field of infinite possibility. But if you fix your gaze on the highest good of which you can conceive, so that that's going to inform your path forward, there will appear in front of you a little thread of interest that says, come this way or come this way. It's this finesse, this little shining thing out in front of you. And that looks kind of like teleology to me.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson is talking about it more in terms of motivating people and so on, whereas I'm looking at it more from the point of view of how do we know what's true?
No, definitely. That's exactly what he's talking about, is how do you know what's true? That's been his whole search. And I know that most of what comes up online from him is things related to the things that have made him infamous, let me say. But I read his book, Maps of Meaning. I'm almost 3 times through now. And that's exactly what he's looking for, is how do you know something is true? He's so focused on truth that one of the big things he talks about is the thing that will destroy an entire civilization is when we stop speaking truth. Oh, yeah. So you have to speak the truth, or even if you can't figure out what the truth is, at least don't speak lies.
Right.
right? Because that'll bring down a civilization. That's what happened in Nazi Germany. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. And it's what's beginning to happen today, because we've lost track of where truth lies in our country, and people are no longer courageous enough to speak truth, because when you do, you get canceled, right? Which is remarkable to me, by the way, that you haven't gotten canceled yet.
It's remarkable to me too. Yeah, I still have a Facebook page. I still have a Twitter account. I'm not quite sure what it is. I mean, I sometimes try to think, well, maybe it's the way I phrase things. I'm not a confrontational person.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when people read my book, Love Thy Body, which does deal with cutting edge issues like abortion, euthanasia, the hookup culture, homosexuality, transgenderism. Anyway, when people read it, the most common response I get is, it's so compassionate. I mean, it's clearly standing for biblical truth.
Mm-hmm.
But I did lots and lots of reading groups. I do reading groups with my books now, where I get feedback, largely former students,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes other groups, apologetics groups, and so on. And as a result, I find out everything I said that could be taken wrong. You know, I'm not worried about offending because it's true, but I don't want to offend unnecessarily because I inadvertently said something a certain way. And so all the rough edges get worked off. And so I'm guessing that that's why, at least so far. But we'll see.
Well, I also think the Lord is faithful, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have a shield about you.
But a lot of good people still have gotten canceled. So you're right. I just keep praying that God would use my work to help people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I've kept you way past the time commitment that you made to me. But I would hope that sometime in the future we could talk again. I would, especially if I read Saving Leonardo, could we have a conversation about that one?
That one has a lot to talk about. Yeah, sure. Yes. Let's do that.
That would be so great. You've given me many avenues that I need to pursue now. I have to read The Soul of Science and Saving Leonardo and try to straighten out some of my own thinking. And I will put a lot of things in the information part underneath the video so that you'll have some resources as well.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Professor
Well, thank
Pearcey.
you.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.